A mob boss walked into a five-star restaurant with one impossible wish: to share a meal with his deaf mother. 50 staff members stood frozen. Not one could help. Then a broke, terrified waitress stepped forward and changed both their lives forever. But the moment she made that man's mother laugh, she also made herself a target. This channel is home to stories about powerful men with scarred hearts, the love that breaks them open, and the families worth dying for. This story is proof that the smallest act of kindness can start a war and end one. Like this video if it touched your heart, share it with someone who believes in quiet courage, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.
The Onyx Room was less of a restaurant and more of a fortress with a five-star menu. It was perched high on Chicago's Gold Coast, a place where the city's powerful came to wash away their sins with expensive wine. The light fixtures were worth more than a suburban home. The heavy velvet curtains could swallow a gunshot, and the waitstaff were trained to be completely unnoticeable. Sophie Bennett was the best at being unnoticeable. At 23, Sophie was a whisper in a black vest. She knew how to walk without making the floorboards creak, how to move without clinking the silverware, and how to avoid catching anyone's attention. She was the server who took your coat and was forgotten 5 seconds later. She was the one who topped off your wine before you knew the glass was low. But tonight, the atmosphere in the kitchen felt thick, like the air right before a storm. "He is coming," the manager, Mr. Halloway, whispered, dabbing sweat from his shiny scalp. This man was usually all business and control, but tonight he looked like he was about to be sick. Table 1, the private booth. The tablecloths need to be ironed again. The silverware has to be polished so bright it hurts to look at. "Am I clear?" The kitchen staff scrambled in a controlled panic. Head chefs were yelling. Assistant chefs were shaking. Sophie was by the coffee machine, polishing a single spoon, her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm inside her chest. "Who's coming?" asked Chloe, a new hostess wearing too much makeup and not enough common sense. "Moretti," a cook grumbled, never looking up from the onions he was chopping. Dominic Moretti. The name fell into the room like a chunk of concrete. Dominic Moretti. The newspapers called him a logistics expert. The streets called him the undisputed king of Chicago. He took charge of the family operation 3 years ago, right after his father was shot on Wacker Drive. Since that time, the crime rate in his territory had strangely gone down, mainly because any unauthorized criminals had a habit of disappearing. He was 32, brutally handsome, and known for his quiet demeanor. If Moretti was speaking, you were fine. If he stopped talking, you were already gone. "He has a guest," Halloway barked, snapping his fingers in Sophie's direction. "Bennett, you are assigned to water and bread service on the main floor. You will not go near table 1. I am assigning Pierre to that table. Pierre knows how to handle our more demanding clients." Sophie just nodded, keeping her gaze down. "Yes, sir." The last place she wanted to be was near table 1. She simply wanted to work her shift, get her tips, and return to her quiet apartment in Rogers Park. She had rent due, and her grandmother's medical bills were stacking up on her counter like a pile of snow. She had no time for trouble, but trouble often seeks out the quietest people. By 8 p.m., the restaurant was filled with a low buzz of conversation. The lights were turned down to a soft, golden glow. Sophie drifted between the tables, pouring water, skillfully avoiding the wandering hands of tipsy stockbrokers, and always keeping her head down. And then the main doors swung open. It was not a typical arrival. The background noise of the restaurant did not just quiet down. It was cut off completely. Conversations died in the middle of a word. Forks stopped in midair. Dominic Moretti had arrived. He was much taller than he appeared in the grainy tabloid pictures. He had on a dark gray suit that fit him like a second skin, expertly cut to conceal the weapon everyone knew he was carrying. His dark hair was combed back, revealing a face with sharp, defined lines and zero emotion. He scanned the room once, like a hawk surveying its territory, before turning slightly. He was not by himself, But he was not with a beautiful model or a tough-looking associate. He was helping an elderly woman. She was very small, wearing a simple black dress with a lace collar that seemed to be from the 1950s. Her hair was completely white and tied back in a tight, neat bun. She held onto Dominic's arm so tightly that her knuckles were white. She seemed absolutely terrified. This was Isabella Moretti, the family ghost. Nobody knew much about Dominic's mother. Some whispered that she was mentally unwell. Others said she had a long-term illness. The majority of people were not even aware she was still alive. She had disappeared from public view many years ago. Dominic guided her through the now silent dining room. 4 bodyguards moved with them, their eyes constantly checking every dark corner, watching any hand that moved a little too quickly. They arrived at table 1, the private booth hidden behind thick velvet drapes. Sophie was just 3 tables over, refilling water for a couple who were bickering about their prenuptial agreement. She could feel the wave of cold that came from that group. She watched Pierre, the lead waiter, perspire as he neared the table. Pierre was a proud Frenchman who was normally impossible to rattle. Right now, he looked like a condemned man walking to his execution. "Good evening, Mr. Moretti," Pierre said, his voice trembling just a bit. "Madame, a pleasure to have you at the Onyx Room." Dominic paid him no attention. His focus was completely on his mother. He gently pulled out her chair and helped her settle in with a kindness that felt out of place for a man with his fearsome reputation. He straightened her shawl. He pushed a candle a few inches away from her hand. "Ma," Dominic said, his voice a low, rough whisper. He leaned in very close. "Are you okay?" The old woman gave no sign of hearing him. She just stared forward at the white linen, her eyes looking glassy and distant. She appeared confused, completely overwhelmed by the dim lights and the dancing flames of the candles. "She is fine," Dominic stated to no one in particular, but his jaw was clenched. He looked up at Pierre. "Give us a moment. Bring water. No ice. Just room temperature. Right away, monsieur." Sophie watched this all from the corner of her eye. She noticed the tightness in Dominic's shoulders. It was not the alertness of a crime boss worried about an attack. It was the heavy strain of a son who felt like he was failing. She knew that expression well. She had seen it on her own face in the mirror countless times. 20 minutes went by. The mood in the restaurant had shifted to a low, anxious murmur, but everyone was still sneaking glances toward table 1. Something was clearly going wrong. Pierre had gone back to the table on 3 separate occasions. Each time he came back, he looked even more flustered and helpless. Mr. Halloway was anxiously walking back and forth near the kitchen entrance, wringing his hands. Sophie was clearing a nearby table, trying to remain invisible, but she could hear the raised voices coming from the private booth. "I told you, ask her what she would like to eat." Dominic's voice was getting louder. It was not quite a yell, but it had the deep rumbling of an approaching storm. "I have tried, Mr. Moretti," Pierre said with a stammer. "I described the evening's specials. I recommended the branzino. She is not responding to me at all." "She is not an idiot," Dominic shot back. "She is just—" He stopped himself, rubbing a hand across his tired face. "Just bring the menu again. Bring the one that has pictures. Do you even have a menu with pictures?" "This is a Michelin-starred restaurant, monsieur," Pierre declared, his professional pride briefly winning out over his sense of self-preservation. "We do not use picture menus." Dominic pushed his chair back and stood up. The legs of the chair made a loud scraping noise on the floor that sounded like a gunshot. "Then you figure out what she wants to eat," Dominic snarled. "She has not eaten anything in 2 days. She is scared. She is confused, and you are just standing there listing off a bunch of French words that she does not understand." "I am speaking in English, sir." "She cannot hear you," Dominic finally roared. The entire restaurant became deathly quiet once more. Dominic stopped, as if he just realized he had shouted. He looked down at his mother. Isabella did not even react to the loud noise. She was still looking at the tablecloth, pulling at a single loose thread, completely lost in her own silent world. She is deaf, Dominic said, his voice now a low, menacing whisper. She lost her hearing 3 years ago. The hearing aids bother her skin. She refuses to wear them. She can read lips, but it is too dark in here. She cannot see your mouth properly. Pierre looked totally lost. I could bring a notepad and pen. She has arthritis. Dominic snapped. It hurts her to hold a pen for very long. Just look at her hands. Isabella's hands were knotted, her fingers bent and twisted. She glanced up at Dominic, her eyes full of confusion. She made a small, frustrated noise, a sound from the back of her throat that people who cannot hear sometimes make when trying to speak, without being able to hear their own voice. A few patrons at a nearby table stirred uncomfortably. One woman in a bright red dress let out a nervous giggle. Dominic's head snapped in the direction of the laugh. His eyes were filled with fury. "Did you find something amusing?" he asked. The woman in red turned completely white. "No, I just—" "Get out," Dominic ordered. "I am sorry? Get out!" The woman and her date quickly got up, abandoning their half-finished dinners, and nearly sprinted toward the exit. Dominic turned his attention back to Pierre. "I need someone who can actually communicate with her. Now. Find me an employee who knows sign language. ASL. You have 50 people working here. Surely one of them knows it." Holloway, the manager, quickly came over. "Mr. Moretti, I am so very sorry. I do not think any of our current staff has that specific training. I could try to interpret by writing on a tablet." "She despises screens," Dominic said, his patience completely gone. "She believes they are used to spy on her. I brought her here because she once loved a place from 20 years ago. I just wanted one decent meal. Only one." He glanced at his mother. Isabella appeared on the verge of tears. She fumbled at the table for her water, but the glass was just beyond her grasp. "Let's just go," Dominic said with a tone of defeat. "We are done here." He started to pull back his mother's chair. This was the moment Holloway dreaded. If Moretti stormed out, the Onyx Room's reputation would be ruined. Vendors would cut them off. Health inspectors would suddenly appear. The restaurant would be shuttered within a month. Holloway desperately scanned his team. "Does anyone here know sign language? I will pay a $5,000 bonus right now." His staff stared at the floor. The kitchen crew just shook their heads. Pierre pretended to study the ceiling. Sophie was frozen by the service station. Her heart was pounding against her chest so hard it hurt. She knew how. Her little brother Toby had been deaf from birth. For 10 years, she was his connection to the world, his ears and his voice, until meningitis took him 2 years ago. Her hands still knew all the signs. Her heart still knew the quiet. But stepping up to Dominic Moretti, the man who had just thrown out a couple for laughing too loud, a man whose very name was spoken in hushed, fearful tones. "Don't you dare, Sophie," her mind screamed at her. "Just stay invisible." She watched Dominic try to help his mother get up. Isabella resisted, looking lost and pained, as if she thought she had caused the problem. She looked so fragile. In her face, Sophie saw her own grandmother. In her frustration, she saw Toby. And before her mind could protest, her feet started moving. Sophie took one step forward, and then another. "Mr. Holloway," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Holloway whipped around to face her. "Bennett? What is it? Not right now." Sophie swallowed hard. She held her serving tray like it was a shield. "I think I can help." Dominic froze. He turned his head slowly. Sophie could feel his intense stare like a physical weight. He looked her over, from her worn-out shoes to the messy bun in her hair. His expression was doubtful, almost offended that this small, trembling waitress would dare to speak. "You?" Dominic said sharply. "You know American Sign Language?" "Yes, sir," Sophie whispered back. "I am fluent." Dominic glared at her for a long, tense moment. He then gestured toward the table. "You have 2 minutes," he warned. "If you waste my time, I will make sure you never find work in this town again." Sophie just nodded. She placed her tray on a nearby stand. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed down her apron. She walked right past a shocked Pierre and a petrified Holloway, entering the warm candlelight of table 1. She kept her eyes off Dominic. She knelt right beside Isabella's chair. Kneeling was completely against the rules. Waitstaff always stood, but Sophie understood that to be heard, she first had to be seen. She had to meet her at eye level. Isabella flinched as Sophie suddenly appeared beside her. The older woman's eyes shot to Dominic with a look of panic. Sophie offered a smile. It was not her usual customer service smile. This one was gentle and real. She lifted her hands. "Hello," Sophie signed. Her motions were smooth, natural, and elegant. "My name is Sophie. You look very lovely this evening." Isabella went still. Her eyes grew wide. The panic on her face gave way to pure disbelief. Dominic watched every move like a predator, his hand resting close to his jacket. Isabella hesitantly lifted her own knotted hands. Her fingers were slow and stiff from arthritis. "You speak with your hands," Isabella signed in reply. "Yes," Sophie signed. "I am your server tonight. The food is excellent, but the chef is a very grumpy man." Isabella blinked, and then, like a small miracle, a smile appeared on her face. A short, raspy chuckle escaped her lips. "My son is grumpy too," Isabella signed, nodding toward Dominic. Sophie looked up at him. He was just staring, his mouth hanging open slightly. He glanced from his mother's smiling face to Sophie's hands. "He loves you very much," Sophie signed to Isabella. "He wants this to be a wonderful dinner for you. What would you like to eat? Something easy to chew? Something with a little spice?" The tension in Isabella's shoulders eased, and she seemed to relax by 3 inches. She leaned closer to Sophie. "I would like the scallops, and I want wine. Red wine. Do not tell him. He says I should only drink water." Sophie chuckled quietly. She stood and faced Dominic. "She would like the scallops, sir, and a glass of Pinot Noir. She also said that I should not tell you about the wine." Dominic looked over at his mother. Isabella gave him a stubborn look, clutching her napkin tightly. For the first time that evening, the cold look in Dominic's eyes softened. He looked directly at Sophie. He truly saw her. "She wants wine?" he asked, his voice much gentler. "Yes, sir." "Bring her the entire bottle," Dominic ordered. Sophie turned back to Isabella and signed. "He said that you are the boss." Isabella beamed. She reached up and gently patted Sophie's cheek. Dominic sat back down. His bodyguards visibly relaxed. Holloway let out a long breath, slumping against a wall in relief. "What did you say your name was?" Dominic asked. His gaze was fixed on Sophie. "It is Sophie, sir. Sophie Bennett." "Sophie," he said again, as if testing the name. "You are not going anywhere, Sophie. You will be serving our table tonight. Only you. Tell Pierre he can leave." "Yes, sir." Sophie got to her feet, her legs shaking. She had actually done it. She had made it through. But as she started for the kitchen, she saw Dominic watching her. He was no longer looking at her like she was just a waitress. He was looking at her like she was a riddle he was determined to figure out. And that is when she saw him. A man sitting at the bar, 3 seats away, watching everything in the mirror's reflection. He was not looking at Dominic. His eyes were on her. When he noticed she saw him, he tapped the side of his nose twice. A chill went down Sophie's spine. She knew that signal. Sophie fled to the kitchen, her heart racing wildly. The big, swinging doors closed behind her, silencing the dining room and throwing her into the familiar kitchen noise of clanging pots and yelling chefs, but all of it sounded far away, drowned out by the sound of blood pounding in her ears. Holloway rushed over, his face red with excitement. "You are a miracle worker! I saw them laughing. Laughing! The Moretti table is actually laughing. Do you have any idea what this means for us?" Sophie grabbed the edge of a steel counter, her knuckles turning white. "I just need a moment, Mr. Holloway." "Take 5 minutes. Take 10 minutes. Have some dessert." Holloway was practically bouncing. "Just go back out there and make sure the Queen Mother stays happy. If tonight goes well, I can promise you a big promotion. Sophie gave a weak nod and escaped into the dry goods pantry, pulling the door shut. There, in the dim light among bags of flour and huge cans of tomatoes, she let the fear wash over her. She sank to the floor, pulling her knees to her chest. The man at the bar. She knew who he was. Not by name, but she knew his kind. He was Mick the Rat. O'Shea. He was a low-level enforcer, a debt collector for the O'Hanlon crew, the Irish syndicate that ran the Southside docks. They were the very reason her father had to skip town 5 years ago, leaving Sophie and her ailing grandmother with a debt that never got smaller, no matter how many extra shifts she picked up. The tap on the nose was not a friendly gesture. It was a clear message. We are watching you. We know this is where you work. We know where your grandmother lives. And now, the O'Hanlons had seen her getting friendly with Dominic Moretti, the biggest rival to every other crime family in Chicago. To Mick, this did not look like she was just doing her job. It looked like she had chosen a side. Breathe, she signed to herself in the darkness. Just breathe. She knew she could not run. If she did, they would pay a visit to her grandmother's nursing home. She had to see the shift through. She had to act like everything was perfectly fine. Sophie splashed some cold water on her face from a prep sink, straightened out her apron, and forced herself to walk back out to the dining room floor. When she got back to table 1, the entire mood had changed. The awful silence was gone. Isabella was enjoying her scallops, her face alive as she signed excitedly to Dominic. Dominic was leaning in, trying to follow his mother's hands with an intensity that tugged at Sophie's heart. He was trying his best to understand, but he was catching less than half of it. Sophie stepped back into the light. Dominic looked up, and for just a moment, his defenses lowered. He actually looked happy to see her. She is telling a story, Dominic said in a low voice. Something about a bird, a blue one. Sophie watched Isabella's quick hands. And the blue jay flew down and snatched the ribbon right off the porch railing. Your father laughed so hard he spilled his coffee all over himself. It was a blue jay, Sophie translated gently as she poured more wine for Isabella. It took a ribbon from your porch. She said your father laughed and spilled his coffee. Dominic's eyes grew wider. A small smile touched his lips, a genuine one this time. I remember that day. I was 6 years old. That was my birthday ribbon. He looked at his mother and nodded, making a clumsy sign. I remember. Isabella clapped her hands together without a sound, her eyes smiling. She then turned to Sophie. He was such a messy child, Isabella signed. He always had dirt on his pants. Now he wears these expensive suits and looks like he is going to a funeral. Sophie had to cover her mouth to hide a giggle. She said you used to be a messy boy, and now she thinks you dress like a funeral director. Dominic actually chuckled. It was a deep, rough sound, like an old engine that had not been started in years. The sound was so unexpected that it made people all over the restaurant turn their heads. The entire staff froze in place. Dominic Moretti let out a laugh. Tell her these suits are worth more than this entire building, Dominic commanded, his gaze fixed on Sophie. A current passed between them in the air. It was more than just appreciation. It was the special bond of translation. Sophie was the connection between his emotions and his mother's thoughts. For a man who managed everything except this one silence, Sophie was the strongest person in the room. So, Sophie, Dominic said, leaning back as he swirled his wine, where did you become so fluent? My brother, Sophie replied softly. Toby. He was born deaf. Dominic noticed the past tense right away. He passed on 2 years ago. Dominic's face clouded with genuine sympathy. I am truly sorry. He would have liked you, Sophie lied. The truth was, Toby would have been scared to death of Dominic. Toby liked men who took care of their mothers. Dominic just stared at her. The air grew thin, electric. And what about you? Dominic asked. Who takes care of you, Sophie? The question was heavy, hanging between them. A sudden chill ran up Sophie's spine. She glanced over at the bar's entrance. The stool where Mick had been sitting was now empty, but something was left on the counter. It was a cocktail napkin, held down by a cherry stem. "I can handle myself, sir," Sophie answered, her voice shaking just a little. "I find that hard to believe," Dominic murmured. He pulled a business card from his jacket pocket. It was a black card with only a gold phone number pressed into it. "If anyone bothers you, management, customers, anyone, you call this number directly, 24 hours a day." He slid the card across the white linen. Sophie looked at it. Accepting that card felt dangerous. It was like signing a contract, but turning it down could offend him. Isabella reached over and gently tapped Sophie's hand. "Take it. He can be a grizzly bear, but he is a good one." Sophie accepted the card, sliding it into her apron. "Thank you, Mr. Moretti." "Dominic," he corrected her. "Mr. Moretti was my father, and I am certain he is the one who spilled the coffee." The meal started to wrap up. Isabella said no to dessert but requested some tea. By the time they were set to depart, the restaurant was beginning to close. Dominic rose and assisted his mother with her thick wool coat. He looked at Sophie. "Walk us to the door," he said. It sounded more like an order than a question. Sophie escorted them to the valet station. The wind blowing off Lake Michigan was harsh, slicing right through her thin uniform. The bodyguards quickly got into formation. A polished black sport utility vehicle pulled up. Before she got inside, Isabella hugged Sophie. It was a surprisingly strong, bony embrace. "Thank you, little bird," she signed. Dominic was standing by the car's open door, the streetlights threw sharp shadows on his face. He watched Sophie as she shivered in the cold. "Do you have a coat?" he asked. "It is inside. I have to finish my closing duties." "Right," he paused, as if he wanted to add something more. "The gratuity is included." "But this?" He pushed a folded stack of bills into her hand. "This is for the conversation. You let me have my mother back for one night." "I do not forget favors, Sophie. It was my pleasure, Dominic." He held her eyes for a moment too long, then gave a nod and entered the car. The heavy door clicked shut. The vehicle sped off, vanishing into the Chicago night. Sophie stood there for a second, holding the money. She felt a warmth spread through her despite the cold. Then the napkin came back to her mind. She hurried back inside, past the busboys clearing tables, and made her way to the bar. The napkin was right where she left it. She picked it up. Scrawled in a jagged red ink, likely from a drink stirrer, were two words: "The alley. Now." Sophie felt her stomach plummet. She looked toward the rear exit. The alley was the only route to the employee lockers and her bus stop. She glanced at the front door. It was locked. The manager had already lowered the security gate. The only way out was through the back. She was cornered. The alley behind the Onyx room was a tight channel of brick and steam. Dumpsters were pushed against one wall, overflowing with the evening's garbage. The only illumination was a single flickering bulb over the steel back door. Sophie stepped outside, pulling her coat tightly around her neck. The cold air was thick with the smell of trash and snow. She gripped her purse with both hands, her knuckles white. "Hello?" she said in a whisper. There was nothing, only the far-off scream of a siren and the steady drip from an air conditioning unit. She began walking quickly with her head down, aiming for the streetlight at the alley's end. Her shoes echoed on the damp pavement. Click, clack, click, clack. Then, a figure separated itself from the wall. Sophie gasped and whirled around. Mick O'Shea stepped into the weak light. He was a thin man with a sharp face and eyes that looked like shattered glass. He had on a cheap leather jacket and was chewing on a toothpick. Behind him, two more men appeared from behind the dumpsters. They were larger, moved slower, and wore hooded sweatshirts. "Mick," Sophie breathed out, "I do not have the money. Not until the 1st of the month. You know that is the arrangement." Mick let out a dry, scratching laugh. He moved in closer, invading her personal space. She could smell old cigarettes and peppermint liquor. This is not about the money, sweetheart, though your interest is definitely adding up. Your grandma's nursing home is not cheap, is it? Leave her out of this, Sophie said, her voice trembling. I am just a concerned member of the community, Mick sneered. He reached out and touched the collar of her coat. We saw you in there tonight with the butcher, looking very friendly. A lot of hand-talking, a lot of smiling. I was only doing my job, Sophie stammered. She backed away until she felt the cold brick wall. His mother is deaf. I was just interpreting for them. Mick slammed his open hand against the wall right beside her head. Sophie winced, and a tiny cry escaped her. Do not lie to me, Mick hissed. You were whispering to him. You were laughing with him. Moretti does not laugh. What did you say to him? Did you tell him about us? About your father's debt? No, I swear. We only talked about the food. Nonsense, Mick spat. He leaned in so close his nose nearly touched hers. This is the situation, Sophie. You have a very special opportunity. You are going to be our new set of ears. Since you are so skilled with your hands, you are going to use them to help us out. What? What are you talking about? The next time he comes here, you pay attention. You find out where he is moving that shipment next Thursday, and you find out who he is meeting. Mick grinned, showing his yellowed teeth. And if you refuse, well, old women have very fragile bones. Accidents in nursing homes happen constantly. A fall down some stairs, a slip in the bathtub. Sophie felt sick to her stomach. Please, I cannot do that. He would kill me. He might, Mick shrugged. But I most certainly will. So it is your choice. The butcher or the rat? He reached into her pocket. Sophie went rigid. He took out the stack of cash Dominic gave her. Consider this your first payment, Mick said, stuffing the money in his pocket. Now get lost and remember, we are always watching. Mick started to leave, his thugs chuckling behind him. Sophie slid down the wall, hot tears streaming down her face. She felt like she was going to throw up. She had lost the money. She was stuck between two rival mobs. And now her grandmother was a pawn. Hey, Mick, a voice called from the shadows. It was not Sophie. It was deep, composed, and had a terrifying authority. Mick stopped dead. He turned around slowly to face the alley entrance. A figure was outlined by the streetlights. The red glow of a cigar lit up a chiseled jawline. It was Dominic Moretti, and he was not by himself. Two of his bodyguards, who were like mountains in wool coats, were blocking the only way out. Mr. Moretti, Mick stammered, all of his confidence gone in an instant. We were just having a conversation with the girl. We are old family friends. Dominic took a long draw from his cigar and blew out a cloud of smoke. He walked forward with heavy, deliberate steps. He stopped 3 feet from Mick, looming over him. She is a waitress, Mick, Dominic said in a casual tone. She brings out pasta. She serves wine. She does not have friends that look like you. It is just a misunderstanding, Dom, Mr. Moretti. Her father had a debt with the O'Sheas. We are just here to collect. Is that so? Dominic glanced over Mick's shoulder at Sophie, who was curled up against the wall. She was shaking uncontrollably. For a brief moment, Dominic's eyes softened, but they turned back into hard, black diamonds when he looked at Mick. She served my mother this evening, Dominic said quietly. She made my mother smile. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Look, just take the money, Mick said. He pulled the wad of cash from his pocket, holding it out with a hand that trembled. You keep it. We are square. Dominic glanced at the cash. Then he looked at Mick's hand. You put your hands on her, or, Dominic said. It was a statement, not a question. You put your hands inside her pockets. Get him. The order was almost a whisper. The two bodyguards moved with frightening speed. Before Mick even had a chance to scream, they had him pinned to a dumpster. His two thugs looked at each other and then ran for it, sprinting right past Dominic. Dominic did not even bother to turn his head. He let them get away. He was only interested in the rat. Dominic approached Mick. He took the cigar from his lips and studied its glowing end. "This is my city," Dominic said with calm. "And the people who work inside this building, the staff, they belong to me. If you tax them, you are taxing me. If you threaten them, you are threatening me." "I am sorry." "I did not know," Mick squealed. "You knew." Dominic took the cash out of Mick's hand. He turned and walked back to Sophie. He knelt down, not caring that slush was soaking the trousers of his expensive suit. He held the money out to her. "Are you all right?" he asked. Sophie could only shake her head, completely unable to form words. She was shivering so intensely that her teeth began to chatter. When she tried to stand, her knees gave out. Dominic was there to catch her. His grip felt secure, warm, and immensely powerful. He pulled her upright, holding her steady against his body. She smelled expensive cologne, tobacco, and the subtle trace of gunpowder. "I cannot be seen with you," Sophie whispered, her fear rising once more. "They will kill her, my grandmother." Dominic looked down into her eyes. "No, they will not." He then faced Mick, who the guards still held. "Listen to me very carefully, Mick." Dominic's voice cut through the wind. "Your debt is erased. The girl is untouchable. The grandmother is untouchable. If I hear that they have been harmed in any way, I will find you. And I will take both of your hands so you can never again touch anything that belongs to me. Do you understand me?" "Yes, yes, oh God, yes," Mick sobbed. "Put him in the garbage," Dominic commanded. The guards threw Mick into a nearby dumpster. He landed with a wet thud and a sharp cry. Dominic then gave his complete attention back to Sophie. He removed his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was large, warm, and comforting. "My car is just around the corner," Dominic said. "I am taking you home." "I cannot," Sophie protested, her voice weak. "This only makes things much worse." "Sophie," Dominic said, holding her shoulders firmly. He made her look directly at him. "You are not invisible anymore. You tried to be, but that is over. You stepped forward to protect my mother. Now you are under my protection, and nothing harms what I protect." He let the words sink in. "Now," he said softly, "where does your grandmother live? We must send some men to watch her nursing home just in case." Sophie stared at him. She recognized the violence he was capable of course. But she also saw the man who had remembered a blue jay and a simple ribbon. She understood with a frightening clarity that she had only swapped a debt to a street thug for a debt to the king of the city. "Rogers Park," she whispered. "She is at St. Jude's." Dominic nodded. He guided her to the end of the alley, his arm protectively around her. "Let us go," he said. "You will quit this job tomorrow." "What?" "I cannot. I need the money." "You are not going to be a waitress any longer, Sophie," Dominic said as he opened the door to his large vehicle. "My mother needs a companion, someone who can speak her language, and I need someone that I can trust." He paused, his dark eyes fixed on her. "And at this moment, you are the only person in all of Chicago who has not lied to me." The Moretti estate was in Lake Forest, a massive compound of limestone and wrought iron concealed behind a gate strong enough to stop a tank. To the public, it was a piece of history. To the criminal world, it was the command center where Dominic Moretti planned the city's future. To Sophie, it was a beautiful cage, but one that offered a warmth she had never known. 2 weeks had passed since that night in the alley. Sophie had left the Onyx room the very next morning. Her grandmother, Rose, had been relocated to a private suite at St. Jude's, financed by a front company that Sophie knew traced back to Dominic. The security team outside Rose's room was subtle but effective. Sophie stayed in the guest wing of the Moretti home, in a room bigger than her old apartment, with a view of the frozen lake. Her role was clear: be Isabella's voice, be her friend. Each morning, Sophie would join Isabella in the sunroom. They would share tea and play games of chess. And they communicated. Sophie's hands moved with speed, translating the news, the talk among the staff, and the memories Isabella had kept silent for so long. Isabella began to thrive. The state of confusion that troubled her at the restaurant was now disappearing. With her ability to communicate returned, her sharp humor also came back. Isabella signed one Tuesday morning as she watched Dominic through the glass doors of his office. He was pacing on the phone, his tie loose and a frown on his face. "He loves you," Sophie said, then signed the words. "He wants to keep you safe." "Safety is dull," Isabella signed back quickly. "I want grandchildren. I want activity. I want him to look at a woman the same way he looks at you when he thinks nobody can see." Sophie felt her face grow warm and almost dropped her cup. "He does not look at me that way. My dear girl, I am deaf, not blind." Sophie glanced toward the office. He stopped walking back and forth. His gaze found hers through the glass window. His frown dissolved, and he offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. A tense energy, like a live wire, hummed between them. The full weight of her new circumstances crashed down on her later that night. Dominic entered the library where Sophie was in the middle of a book. He looked completely drained. A fresh bruise covered his knuckles, and a dark splatter stained his cuff, which he had obviously tried to remove. "How was she doing today?" Dominic asked while pouring a glass of whiskey. He made no move to offer her any. He was aware she did not drink. "She is happy," Sophie replied, marking her spot in the book. "She defeated me in chess 2 times, and she is set on attending the opera gala on Saturday." Dominic went rigid. The glass halted just before it reached his lips. "That charity ball event?" "Absolutely not." "She spotted the invitation on your desk," Sophie said in a low voice. "She has been talking about it all day long. She mentioned she has not worn her emeralds in 5 years. She wants to feel like herself again." "Dominic, it is not safe," Dominic said, his voice hard. "The Oanians have been silent since the incident in the alley. Far too silent. If I bring her out in public, it creates a massive security risk." "She is your mother, not an inmate," Sophie retorted, astonished by her own nerve. Dominic spun toward her, his eyes flashing with anger. "Do you have any idea what happens if I make one mistake? Do you understand what individuals like Mick O'Shea do to get to a man like me? They do not target me. They target what I cherish." He paused. The silence that filled the room was overpowering. What I cherish. He had not intended to say that. The unspoken meaning lingered in the air. He was referring to his mother naturally, but the way he looked at Sophie, with an intense, raw, and frightened expression, suggested that his list of cherished things had recently expanded by one. Sophie rose to her feet and moved toward him. She was no longer the timid waitress anymore. Living in this home, seeing the heavy load he carried, had made her courageous. "She needs this," Sophie said softly. "And perhaps you need it as well. You cannot keep everyone locked away in a glass box forever." Dominic looked down at her. He lifted his rough hand and gently touched her cheek. His thumb softly traced her lower lip. "If we go," he said, his voice raspy, "you must stay directly beside her. You will not leave her side. Not for 1 second. You are her ears. You are her protector." "I will not leave her," Sophie promised. "And Sophie," Dominic leaned closer, his forehead touching hers. "If anything seems wrong, if you notice anything, you come tell me. You do not try to be a hero. You run straight to me. I promise." He kissed her then. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, tasting of whiskey and fear and a desire so powerful it felt like she was drowning. When he pulled back, he had the look of a man who had just determined his own destiny. "Get a dress," he said with a rough voice, turning to conceal his expression. "Something very expensive. We are going to the opera." The Chicago Lyric Opera House was a vast space of gold leaf and red velvet, humming with the city's most influential figures. Senators socialized with tech billionaires, and crime bosses in formal wear shared drinks with judges. It was the single night of the year when the boundaries of the law became unclear, all for the sake of charity. Sophie wore a long-sleeved, backless gown of midnight blue silk that Isabella had selected. She felt elegant, but also very exposed. She stayed right at Isabella's side, constantly scanning the room, her hands prepared to translate. Dominic was a stoic figure in his tuxedo. He moved through the people with a deadly grace, shaking hands and offering tight smiles, but his eyes were always scanning. His most trusted lieutenants were placed around the edges of the room, with hidden communication devices. Isabella was glowing. She was the center of attention, smiling as people came to her, waiting for Sophie to translate their praises into sign language. "They are all snakes," Isabella signed with secrecy, a polite smile on her face. "That man over there in the gray suit owes Dominic $2 million. Sophie had to suppress a laugh. "He says you look wonderful, Mrs. Moretti." Everything appeared to be normal until the intermission. The guests began to move toward the grand staircase to get champagne. The sound in the room increased to a loud mix of laughter, clinking glasses, and the orchestra preparing. Sophie felt a strange sensation on the back of her neck. She looked up at the mezzanine. A group of waiters carried trays through the crowd. One of them, a tall man with a scar over his lip, was not paying attention to his tray. He was watching Dominic. Sophie observed him. She understood the movements of servers. She knew how a waiter was supposed to act. This man moved with the precision of a soldier. He lifted a hand to his ear. Then he tapped his nose. Sophie's body went cold. It was the signal, the same one Mick had used in the Onyx room. She looked to the other side of the balcony. Another waiter near a private box entrance tapped his nose in the same way. This was not simply a signal. It was a countdown. Sophie saw Dominic. He was 10 feet away, engaged in a conversation with the mayor. The noise from the crowd was immense. If she yelled, he might not hear her. Worse, the gunman might become alarmed and start shooting into the crowd. Isabella stood right beside her. She had to warn him, but she could not make a sound. Sophie moved into Dominic's direct line of sight. She did not wave, she did not scream. She just lifted her hands to her throat, her face composed, but her eyes locking onto his. Dominic saw her. He stopped mid-sentence. "Trap Sophie" signed. Her movements were sharp, military precise. 3 men, waiters, north balcony, west exit, guns. Dominic didn't flinch. He didn't look up at the balcony. He didn't break his composure. He smiled at the mayor. "Mr. Mayor, if you'll excuse me," Dominic said smoothly. "I believe my mother needs some air." He turned. His hand went to the small of his back. He tapped his earpiece twice, a specific rhythm. "Code black," he whispered. "Mezzanine, the staff." Then all hell broke loose. The fake waiter on the balcony realized he had been made. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a silenced pistol. "Down!" Dominic roared, tackling the mayor and shoving Isabella toward Sophie. Sophie grabbed Isabella, pulling her behind a marble pillar. Just as the screams erupted, the ballroom dissolved into chaos. People trampled each other in a rush for the doors. Dominic was returning fire, his movements precise. His bodyguards surged forward, creating a wall of flesh and Kevlar around the pillar. "Get them out!" Dominic screamed to his head of security, Luca. "Take the service elevator." "Dominic," Sophie screamed, clutching Isabella. "Go." Dominic looked at her, his eyes wild. "I'm right behind you. Go." Luca grabbed Sophie and Isabella, rushing them through a side door into the kitchen corridors. The sound of gunfire echoed behind them, deafening and terrifying. They sprinted down the hallway. Isabella was gasping for air, clutching her chest, but she was running. They reached the service elevator. Luca slammed the button. The doors groaned open. "Get in," Luca barked. Sophie pushed Isabella in, but as she turned to follow, a heavy metal fire door slammed down between the hallway and the elevator bay, triggered by the alarm system. Luca and Isabella were inside the elevator. Sophie was on the other side. "Sophie!" Isabella screamed. her voice distorted, banging on the closing elevator doors. "Go!" Sophie yelled. "Take her down!" The elevator doors slid shut. Sophie was alone in the hallway. She heard footsteps, heavy boots running on tile. She turned. At the end of the corridor, the fake waiter with the scar appeared. He was bleeding from a shoulder wound, his face twisted in a Tums. He saw Sophie. "You!" he spat the little handalker. He raised his gun. Sophie scrambled back, slipping on the polished floor. She had nowhere to go. The fire door was locked. She closed her eyes, waiting for the flash. Bang! The shot was deafening, but Sophie didn't feel pain. She opened her eyes. The assassin was on the floor, a hole in the center of his forehead. Standing behind him, smoke curling from the barrel of a silver Desert Eagle, was Dominic. He was disheveled, his tie gone, his shirt stained with blood that wasn't his. He stepped over the body, his eyes fixed on Sophie. He didn't speak. He crossed the distance in 2 strides and hauled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. He was shaking. The King of Chicago was shaking. "I told you." He buried his face in her neck, breathing in her scent. "I told you to stay with her." "The door." Sophie sobbed, clinging to his ruined shirt. The fire door came down. "I couldn't." "It's okay," Dominic whispered, kissing her hair, her forehead, her tears. "You saved us. You saved everyone. I saw your hands. I saw them." He pulled back, cupping her face. "You spoke to me in the middle of the noise. No one else could have done that." "Is she safe?" Sophie asked. Luca radioed. "She's in the car. She's fine." Dominic's thumb stroked her cheek. "But we have to go. The Oanians. This was a suicide run. They're desperate." He took her hand. "Can you run?" "Yes." "Then run with me. And don't let go." The war that followed lasted 3 days. It was swift, brutal, and fought in the shadows. With the failed assassination attempt at the opera, the Oanian family had overplayed their hand. They had endangered civilians, politicians, and the unspoken truce of the city. Dominic didn't even have to do all the work. The other families, disgusted by the recklessness and fearing the heat the opera shooting would bring, turned on the Oanians. Mikosha was found in a trunk at O'Hare Airport. The Oanian leadership fled to Ireland, never to return. By the 4th day, silence returned to Chicago. But it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of peace. Sophie sat on the terrace of the Lake Forest estate, wrapped in a cashmere blanket. The winter sun was bright, reflecting off the snow. She was watching Isabella teach Dominic sign language. They were sitting on the bench near the garden. Isabella was laughing, correcting Dominic's stiff fingers. "No, like this," Isabella signed. "Thumb out." "You are saying donkey instead of stubborn." Dominic frowned, adjusting his hand. "Like this better," Isabella signed. "But you are still a donkey." Sophie smiled, bringing the tray of espresso over to them. Dominic looked up. The bruises on his face were fading. He reached out and took the tray from her, setting it down on the stone table. Then he took her hand. "Sit," he said. Sophie sat. Isabella watched them, her eyes twinkling. She took her espresso and discreetly turned her chair toward the lake, giving them privacy. "The police report came out today," Dominic said quietly. "They're calling it a gang-related disturbance. No names mentioned." "You're clear, Sophie. You can go back to your apartment. You can go back to your life. Your grandmother's bills are paid in full for the next 10 years. You're free." Sophie felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. "Are you firing me?" Dominic looked at the lake. "I'm giving you an out. This life, you saw what happened at the opera. It's dangerous. It's ugly. You don't belong in the dark, Sophie. You're too good." He let go of her hand. It felt like a physical blow. "I can have a car take you back to Rogers Park within the hour." Sophie looked at him. She saw the pain in his eyes. He was trying to protect her the only way he knew how, by pushing her away. He was terrified that next time the bullet wouldn't miss. She looked at Isabella, who was watching a cardinal in the snow. She looked at the house, the fortress that had become a home. Sophie stood up. Dominic flinched, expecting her to walk away. Instead, she moved to stand directly in front of him. She waited until he looked up. She raised her hands. "I was invisible for 23 years." She signed slowly. "I was a ghost in a restaurant. I was a ghost in my own life." Dominic watched her hands mesmerized. He understood every word. He had been practicing. "You saw me," she continued. "You gave me a voice. If I go back to that apartment, I will be invisible again. I don't want to be safe, Dominic. I want to be heard." She lowered her hands and spoke, her voice steady and strong. "I'm not going anywhere unless you don't want me." Dominic stood up slowly. He looked at this woman, this small, shy waitress who had walked into a lion's den and tamed the beasts with nothing but silence. "I want you," he said, his voice cracking. "I want you more than I want my next breath." "Then stop trying to send me away." Dominic pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. He looked at it, then at her. "I was going to wait," he admitted. "Maybe 6 months, maybe a year to do this properly. But I almost lost you in that hallway, and I don't waste time anymore." He opened the box. Inside was a ring, a vintage emerald surrounded by diamonds. It was Isabella's ring, the one she hadn't worn in years. "My mother gave this to me this morning," Dominic said. "She said if I let you leave, she would disown me." Sophie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Sophie Bennett," Dominic said, dropping to one knee in the snow. "Will you be my voice? Will you be my heart? Will you marry me?" Sophie looked at Isabella. The old woman had turned around. She was grinning, giving Sophie 2 thumbs up. Sophie looked back at Dominic. The King of Chicago was on his knees, waiting for her command. She didn't speak. She didn't sign. She simply knelt down in the snow beside him and kissed him. And in the silence of the winter garden, with the only witness being a deaf mother and a watching cardinal, the shy waitress became the queen. The disturbance at the Onyx Room had started a war. But the silence had started a life. And that is how Sophie Bennett went from pouring water to ruling an empire. It wasn't about the guns or the money or the power. It was about the one thing Dominic Moretti couldn't buy: someone who truly understood him. In a world full of noise, Sophie was the only one who knew how to listen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.